I'm very honored to be here this morning. Why don't I just give a quick background on myself, and then I'm happy to just go over in general what the recruiting process looks like on our end, and then open it up for questions afterwards. Thank you, Emery, for the introduction. So I've done technical recruiting now. I support one of the subsidiaries under Alphabet. So specifically, I support Verily. We are a biotech company, and I primarily recruit for engineers, so software engineers of all levels, from entry level all the way to director levels, as well as all disciplines. So I primarily support data science now as well, but I've done mobile, firmware, back end, front end, full stack, production end, most of the full gambit. Prior to that, I was doing mostly healthcare stuff, and after I switched to tech, I really never looked back. But I will caveat and say I do not represent Verily, but I'm happy to, again, provide my perspective of the interview process. And I will also caveat that most companies do operate differently, even though the main steps are the same. In general, though, I can say, yeah, the main steps are typically the same regardless of what company you're in, but obviously bigger companies and smaller companies, there's typically a pretty big difference in terms of how they interpret candidates. So why don't I start off in the beginning? I think what most people don't necessarily see right away is opening headcount is the first step, right? So when the team looks for a candidate, they're typically looking for a candidate for a reason, right? Smaller companies are going to be much more specific of what they want and what they're looking for and why. Whereas I would say larger companies like the Googles and the Metas and the Amazons, typically when they open headcount, they may have a more of a generalized approach. They might have like, I'm looking for 30 new grads to hire this year, regardless of which team, and then we can figure those pieces out later, which is where you get team matching in the big tech companies. But overall, we kind of look at those different components. So really, if you are a match for what we are looking for, if it's a specific role, if it could fit a different part of the company, or if you have the general basic building blocks that we would kind of need and know that we can teach and foster. If a lot of you guys are coming off with not as much work experience, that's really where I think you should focus on, is being able to really explicitly explain your project and sort of the different components of it. So after the recruiter screening, it's pretty straightforward. Every company does this differently, but manager involvement is also very different. In smaller companies and companies that are a little bit more intimate, and companies that are maybe a little bit more specific, or maybe a manager just likes to be really involved, they're going to be involved in the beginning. So they might want to review the resumes themselves, or they might be in the first phone call. Most large tech companies, though, don't do this, just because some managers are typically really busy, or the process normally does a lot of the work for them. So if it's the first call, typically kind of either be with a recruiter, with a manager, or just straight to technical. Manager and recruiter calls are fairly similar in terms of we're going to take the time to explain to you what the role is, what the company is, and we are kind of fact checking your resume. So if your resume has a lot of fluff, if there's a lot of like, the dates look kind of funny, if there are weird things on the resume, we actually use this time to kind of get a sense of like, what happened here? Or is this actually something we should be worried about? Or if there's anything we wanted to like dig deeper in. Maybe your resume wasn't very clear about project work or experience, then we'll probably want to spend the time to dig deeper into like, okay, what is this project? Can you explain to me what you specifically were responsible for within the project? I think a lot of people can be very high level and they give 1 to 2 sentences, and when they talk through these things, I would practice being able to really spell out, again, sort of the nuances and the complexities of the work that you've done. Manager call, again, would also be very similar. Of course, if you go straight to technical call, which is fairly common in most tech companies, it's normally a 45-minute coding interview. They normally don't do too much behavior interviews, but again, I will caveat every company is different. And Leak code should be your best friend when you do these interviews. Some questions I typically get is the phone interview easier than the on-site interviews? They really shouldn't be. In fact, I normally think the phone interview should be harder so that the chances of passing through the on-site interviews are going to be better. But some people do think that, oh, there's enough in here from the phone interview to pass you on to the on-site interview. So if there was going to be an easier round, that would probably be the phone interview, but I would still be very prepared for it. Sometimes other companies do a second phone interview, but depending on what the results look like from your first one, if it's a go ahead and if it's green, or if basically anyone, they say it looks good to go. The virtual on-sites, most companies don't do actual on-sites anymore. Some still might, some smaller companies will, but most companies at this day and age are not going to ever have you physically on-site at this point, just because it doesn't make sense. We've been doing this for the last 2 years, right? They typically span from 4 to 6 rounds, depending on, again, the company. And depending on the company, it can be mostly technical. There can be some behavior. They can be system design. I can say from a perspective and from like an alphabet perspective, we only ask for 4. And for people who are kind of coming on fairly entry level, it's always 4 coding rounds. So again, data structures, algorithms, be very prepared for those. And of course, leak code, medium hard level is going to be your best friend. If feedback is positive from the interviews, naturally, we go through the, we move you forward. Again, depending on the company size, manager involvement, and the type of style companies have, it's either going to go to offer, or we typically have a team matching phase, right? Big tech companies, like I said before, Meta, Amazon's, Facebook, Google, all that stuff, they typically will do a team matching phase. Meta, for example, you will actually not get a team until after you go into the company and you have to do a boot camp. But most other companies will do a team matching phase, right? This is where I would say it's not so much about technical ability as it is about technical fit sometimes, right? Like, what have you done in the past that will make you relevant to this project? And it's also a really good time for you to figure out if you want to actually work on a certain product. Some products are going to be very boring and some products are going to be interesting. And so I would recommend for you during this period of time, or really any time that you are gut checking and thinking about what projects and teams you want to work on, is, do they provide proper mentorship? Like, will they be able to have the bandwidth to give you guidance and grow? What type of tech are they doing? And if that's an area you're interested in, would they give you a wider breadth of work, or would they give you a more narrow breadth? So like, do you want to get pigeonholed into doing front end work, or do you want to be able to do full stack and get a broader range, right? Or if you're really interested in ML, will it give you the exposure to do certain things like that? What the manager is like is so critical. I tell this to every one of my new grad hires, but like, who your manager is in your first job can really set you up for, and if you have a terrible manager, it's not the end of the world, but having a good one is a really big, it makes a huge difference in terms of what type of guidance and mentorship and opportunities they're going to give you within the team and within the larger scope of their network or their company, right? And let's see. Yeah. Think about these things when you are talking to different teams. And then afterwards, we go through the negotiation/offer process. So most tech companies are going to have very clear what we call bands, so compensation bands. And what that means is that someone coming out of school with this amount of experience, maybe, or with this amount of experience within this geolocation gets paid this much. And there is a band of how much we can do, right? Some of it is really most of it is going to be fairly dependent on your interview performance. And depending on the company, some bands are going to be bigger than others. I highly recommend doing some research as you get to this point, because you want to be able to get a good sense of what you want already, what is actually reasonable. I know I'm coming from a recruiter perspective, but it's always really easy to tell when a candidate is BSing you a little bit. And so, because I know you talk to maybe 5 or 10 recruiters when you look for a job, right? Probably a dozen more. I talk to 5 or 10 candidates on a daily basis. So I think most recruiters can tell you that they have a pretty good idea of what the market is like and what companies are willing to pay and what they aren't willing to pay. So do your proper research, make sure you have an idea of what you might want going into it. Most company structures are going to be very different. And so be sure to ask those questions because they obviously will have larger implications on your livelihood. And also know that not all in a large company, for example, there's only so much that we can do just because of all the structures we have for pay equity, right? What pay equity means is how do we make sure we're paying everyone who's doing the same job fairly and equally and also competitively in the market, right? We don't really, the philosophy is you don't want to bring 2 people in doing the exact same job and having one person being paid obscenely more than the other. So most large tech companies really follow this philosophy, I would say. But when you go to smaller companies and tech and more maybe non-traditional tech, that can be a little bit different. So, but again, if you're doing the large tech companies, pay equity is a pretty big topic. And so their bands are their bands. They only have so much stretch, right? But do your research and make sure you understand what those stretches are. For new grads, I will say most, again, companies, especially large tech companies, have a new grad standard offer. So just kind of understand what that means. Some are not going to do that, but if you are going to fall into this sort of like new grad, fresh out of like boot camp type experience, that's typically where they're going to slot you. And there's really not much mobility at that point. So how do I maximize my compensation? Is a question I also always get. And per my previous points, it typically depends on the company. Some companies, larger tech companies, are going to have bigger flexes than smaller companies. And then also understanding what each of these companies' structure looks like, right? Most big tech companies are going to operate off of total comp. So what does total compensation mean? It's traditionally a breakdown of 3 main components, which is base, bonus, and equity. Depending on where you are in the world, that can also look different. So I can't speak to that as confidently because I'm not really sure. Different structures, different countries do things a little bit differently, but understand what each of those components mean in each of the companies that you're talking to. Yeah, and then we get to the offer phase and you get an offer. You normally get 5 days to about 2 weeks. Larger companies are going to give you a month. Google gives you a standing 1-year offer sometimes, depending on your background and experience. But smaller companies, 5 days is fairly standard. If they force you to make a decision within a 2-day window, I would think about that company because and make sure that they understand that you would want more time, right? I would say the 2-day window ones are not as common, but those are typically the startups. So they move at a slightly faster clip. So high level overview. Any clarification points I can make, and I can also open it up to Q&A at this point too.
Before we start the Q&A part, Susan, one question some of our continuing students may have in mind. So you were mostly referring to new grad applications. And we also have some continuing students who are seeking internship. So can you tell us what would be different, or if there is any difference between the way you approach to new grads versus the way you approach to intern candidates?
Yeah, we're a lot easier with intern candidates. So we obviously won't expect you to be doing full production code the way we would with a new grad. And we will, like new grads, we will look at project experience quite a bit more, right? So I would say it's very similar as long as the building blocks are solid. Again, you have interesting projects on your resume, interesting previous internships, things that show complexity and that you actually know what you're doing and is relevant to the role. I would say the relevancy is more important here just because intern applications tends to be we get thousands for one role, right? And so we look for, okay, this team is building Eng platform, for example. We're going to look for someone that's kind of done something similar to that. Or this team is only going to use Go. We're going to look for someone with Go experience. So we get a little bit pickier when it comes to those things. So looking at the job description and then making sure your resume is relevant to the job will probably be the easiest way for you to get someone's attention.
So also, like, what this means is when we are doing the job applications, if we consider which tech stack we have the experience in, can be helpful. Because if there is a match, then it increases the odds of getting the attention of the recruiter.
Yeah. So if we're looking for like an Android engineer and you have zero Android experience, your resume will probably never be looked at or rejected almost immediately, right? But if it's like a full stack engineering role and you have like the Python, the Java, like kind of the more common stuff, your chances are going to be a little bit better, right?
I see. And Susan, so before starting with the other questions, I have one question on mind, and this is, I have seen that especially for our alumni, this is affecting them from time to time. So some of our candidates, they do the interviews with the companies in similar time window, and as a result, they can have multiple offers to choose from. But as you mentioned, the companies usually give it with a very short time window, like 1 week, 2 weeks, and sometimes not everything may be aligned in such a short amount of time. And this is not recommended, but like people may end up in the situation of saying yes to the first offer because you don't know whether the others are going to come. And after the others come, you may find something more tempting and like break your word, let's say. This is not ideal, but in life this is happening. So can you tell us how things look from the recruiter's perspective at that time? Is there any hard feelings from the company to the candidate? It would be great to know, like what happens on the other end.
It happens to us all the time too. So I always say this, like timing is a big part of recruitment, right? Like there is a perfect job for you somewhere. It might just not be open yet. And vice versa. We think the same thing. There could be a perfect candidate for us somewhere. They're just not looking right now, you know? So timing is really tricky. There is no easy answer to your question for what it's worth, because again, from our perspective, we could be interviewing with 5 different candidates and one candidate might have an expiring offer, but maybe candidate number 5 is a better fit. Do we wait for candidate number 5 or do we make it to the offer to the candidate who meets 75% of what we're looking for? It's going to be very similar to in your version as well. When you are interviewing multiple times and companies all have different timelines. They have their own timelines, right? And so this is how I typically would recommend folks, is just knowing the timing of most companies. Big companies are going to operate a little bit slower. There's team matching involvement. They just take a little bit longer to get back to you. And then there are some companies that are going to be faster. So just knowing the timing of those companies and making sure that you're doing the on-sites roughly around the same time. I would target the big companies first, just because they're going to take longer to get back to you. So other things you can do to be really on top of it is being clear with your recruiting team or the manager, depending again on the size of the company. Like, hey, I'm interviewing with these other companies and this is what the timing is going to look like. And so being really explicit from that in the beginning is going to be very helpful, because if that comes out in the end, we're a little less forgiving at that point. We're like, well, we've already decided to go and make an offer to you, so it's 5 days. We might stretch it a couple of days more, but we won't always do it unless the other company is going to say, I'm going to get back to you within a week, and then we might consider it. So what goes through our head when we hear people say, I have other offers, we think about, okay, how do we stack against these other offers? And I would recommend being very truthful here, but that's obviously my own bias. But if I hear a candidate tell me, I'm interviewing with these 5 different companies, they're going to take another 2 weeks. And then if I ask them, well, how do you feel about us against them? And the answer isn't exactly right, or if it sounds really fake, I normally will say, okay, unfortunately, I'm only going to give you 5 days, because I would understand that you're posturing, right? So be very genuine. Like if you have many choices, really, really dial in on your top 2 and 3. And those are the 2 and 3 I would really focus on, right? I think someone coming out of, again, with maybe like if it's like your first software job or something like that. I see this with new grads all the time. They're like, I'm going to collect all the offers and then I'm going to make a decision from there. I'm going to look at each and every single point and I'm going to like count all those pieces. But I would start prioritizing to your top 2 to top 3. You're about to get an offer from 2 or 3 companies. You should really spend your time and not waste anyone else's time and your time on trying to on getting more paper offers, right? If you are clear that I'm really excited about this, there is one other company I'm really excited about. Is there any way you can wait? People are going to be a little bit more understanding if they feel like, okay, well, we are actually within the running and we are potentially a priority. I'm willing to wait a little bit. Not all of them are going to do that, but some of them could. If it is really like, I have 6 other offers, then I'm like, good luck. It's just, again, all companies are going to be different. Bigger companies are going to be much more willing to wait. Smaller companies are, even like my company size, we would think about, okay, we need something to start fairly quickly. We have 3 other candidates in the mix that are pretty good. If this person isn't going to get back to us in 5 days, we're going to move on. So depends on the situation, depends on the company, and depends on you and your interest, but try to dial in on 2 to 3 that you're really excited about.
This is an excellent advice because you're right. I mean, we are like humans are involved in this process, and the feelings that we create on the other side matters a lot. And if you are like, oh, I have these 10 different options, probably I'll get 6 offers, then it's very different than putting together the strongest 2 or 3, showing that you actually have some other options, right? And putting the strongest ones, which are going to give you probably the strongest power of bargaining. This is a lot better. So this was very insightful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And
there's something wrong with saying I have 6 other offers, but I would recommend saying I have 6 other offers, but you and this other company are the ones I'm actually seriously considering. That's okay to say too, right? It shows that you have bargain power, you have options, and it shows that you're prioritizing the company you're talking to.
So true. And like you made another important point, genuinity. So it is very important to be genuine. Then I think our message resonates a lot better with people. So thanks for also touching to that point. Very cool. So now we are going to continue with some of the questions that are sent by our teammates. And I will try to order them based on like at what process or at what time of the process they come on our way. So the first one. What is the best way to approach a recruiter? And yeah, let's start with this part. It has a follow-up.
Yeah. I mean, if we're talking about from like just reaching out on LinkedIn, I think knowing who your audience is important, right? Like I get people who reach out to me that have 0 relevancy to the role or to the company at all. And sometimes I'm like, why did you reach out to me? And so I think when you reach out to candidates, recruiters, like be genuine, right? Don't write your full life story, but be like, hey, I'm really interested in this company. I saw you worked here. This is why I'm interested, and this is what I can do. Send a resume with them so that they don't have to ask for it. They could just review and see if you're a fit or not, right? If I get a message and it's like a good mess, and it's one of those like, hey, I'm interested because I'm passionate about this. This is what I worked on. Here's my resume. And if I see it and it's a good match, I move forward with these candidates all the time. It's all the ones that have like 0 experience, 0 relevancy, 0 interest that we don't really respond to. And genuinity, I do think that's important.
Mm-hmm. And like regarding the channels, like do you reply to messages on LinkedIn a lot, or does email catch your attention more, like in terms of communication platform?
Yeah. Going to caveat again, everyone's work stream is very different, right? Sourcers, for example, I don't know if you know the difference between sourcers and recruiters, but just to give you like a broad understanding, sourcers are typically people who spend their entire time on LinkedIn, and they mostly do all the initial resumes. So they're going to be much more responsive over LinkedIn. I tend to be a little bit better over email, just because it puts all of my work stream in one place, but everyone's different. I would say I can tell you most recruiters are probably going to be a little bit better over email than they are going to be over LinkedIn, because we get a lot of spam on LinkedIn.
I see. And let's say we send you an email message. So in an ideal message, like how long should it be? Like my guess would be you won't have too much time to look, right? So you want to see a few things that are shining for you. So what are those a few things that you would love to see in a short and sweet email?
Yeah. So I'm lazy. Whenever a candidate gives me everything in one email, I'm like, great, I will actually spend the time and read through it really quickly. So again, like if you bring a job that you're already interested in, like, hey, I'm really interested in this job because of this reason. Here is my resume. Like, I would love to, talk to you or talk to the man, whatever, right? Like, if all of that is in one email and it isn't, again, like an essay, that's perfect. I would think you don't need more than a paragraph, right? Let the CV speak for you, really. I tend to even look at the CV before I look at the email sometimes, just because I do think that it contains way more information. And if there's a job that you're already interested in, great. Again, I would be very mindful about picking jobs. Like, don't send 18 links or like 10 links. Send one or two that show that they're relevant, because it's really obvious to people when you pick a job that has like that you are completely not a fit for, right? That may make no sense. That tells me that you haven't been paying attention, right? So be mindful about what you're sending and that you're actually excited about this job. And it makes it so much easier for us to be like, oh yeah, they are a good fit. Move them forward,
Very cool. Thank you. And the follow-up part is like, what are the red flags for recruiters to ghost someone who approached them?
So ghosting is really common in our industry, unfortunately. And it just has to do with volume. We just get so many outreaches on a day-to-day basis that we try to prioritize the ones that actually make sense. But red flags, I would say normally there's behavior red flags, right? There's some arrogancy that we see a lot in our industry. So we've gotten a couple of emails sometimes that you're just like, what? So those typically get a pretty clear thank you for your interest, not a fit at this time. Other times could be just like being a little too pushy, right? Like if someone doesn't get back to you within 24 hours, I wouldn't freak out. But obviously if it's been like 3 days, if it's been a week, then yes, please appropriately follow up. All right. But if you sent something to them 3 hours ago and they didn't respond to you, it is okay. And we do sometimes get really eager candidates who are like, you didn't respond to me. And I'm like, it's been 5 hours. And so, some of those things, it's again, more behavior driven than anything, right?
Sounds like there are a lot of common things between dating and recruiting.
It really is. I actually think dating and recruiting are very, very similar. One is just going to affect your livelihood a little bit more than the
other. Cool. Thank you. So our main point is first, not taking things personal because of volume of things, or maybe you have already closed the position. So ghosting can happen for the reasons that are not really because of the candidate sometimes, and giving enough room for the communication and waiting for a ping. If we don't get a reply, maybe waiting for a week, because there can be many reasons not to get a reply. But after that, having a proper follow-up would help. Very cool. Thank you. And the next question. So what are the ways that the recruiter contacts the talent first?
Yeah. Most common channels are LinkedIn and applicant pool. So for us, the first thing I do when I have an open rec is I look through our applicant pool, so people who've applied recently or applied before. So sometimes you get rejection emails that said like, hey, thanks for your interest. We'll reach out again if there's another fit. I mean, this is what we do. So we look through our previous applicant pool first, and if someone is a good fit, we'll reach out that way. My personal preference is to reach out people through email than their LinkedIn, because I don't think people check their LinkedIn quite as often if they're not really looking, right? Well, LinkedIn would be a second option. There are other channels too. So networking events, meetup.com, GitHub. There's like social channels too that people can reach out to you on, but the most common ones are those two. So if you're hoping to get more of a reach out, there's ways to do it on LinkedIn that makes your profile much more attractive. Again, do the work for us. So be very thorough in your LinkedIn to make sure you have all the relevant information that someone may be interested in. Some people attach their resumes there. You're free to put your email there if you want, but be careful of spam, right? Like if you're like, I would say be more mindful if you're going to do that. But if you have that all ready to go and it looks appealing, or in your GitHub, whichever type of channel you have all your information relevant there so that someone could be interested in reaching out to you.
Thank you. So next question. This is a hard to answer one, but I think you can generalize to show how the timelines usually look for different open positions. So the question says, what is the best time to apply for full-time to Google? But if you tell us more about like how does opening new seats, looking for candidates and hiring process happen in the background, I think that would be more useful.
Yeah. So in the life cycle of opening roles, we do planning in Q4. So planning typically starts very soon, actually. We start planning around October all the way till end of November, early December. Headcount then gets released January and February. So this is when we know what hiring looks like typically for the rest of the following year. So right now we don't know what 2023 is going to look like, but in a month or so we will. And that's typically when the gates open. And that's actually where we do a lot more new grad hiring as well. So that tends to be pretty common. Most of the hiring peaks end around this time. So I would say between summer and I would say spring and summer tends to be the heavier hiring seasons, just because we just got a lot of open roles. People are kind of starting their year and they're thinking about what type of resourcing they need for the rest of the year to build up projects and timelines. By the time it gets to this point of the year, hiring typically slows down. I'm going to caveat, all companies are going to be very different, but most big tech companies, this is typically where we kind of slow down a little bit. Also, once holidays comes, we know no one's going to start a new job in the middle of the holiday season, and it's harder to interview during then too. So normally when we're interviewing in the winter, it's for people to start in January.
I see. Thank you. So we should follow actually those cycles of when the openings are coming to the websites, right? When the search is starting, and that may be a good time, right? That may be a good indication that the seats are open, available. Now we can go after them.
I think with Google in particular, summer is their biggest like new hire push because a lot of people are graduating, right? So you're going to have to understand certain companies are going to have certain schedules. And most companies typically are hiring year round, but for the biggest like opening and biggest amount of openings, I would say that's the normal schedule.
Very cool. Thank you. And so this was already mentioned, but repetition definitely helps. And like when you are checking out a CV or a resume, like what do you look for? What things are shining for you?
Yeah. So if it's again a specific role, I look for the specific things, right? Like for example, I have a data scientist role that is in molecular genetics, right? And so I look for just that. I don't look for really anything else. And if they don't have anything that says that they've done those things, I automatically reject, right? So depending on the role, there could be specific things. for more of a generalist roles, I look for sort of, again, the basics, right? So if there is a tech that we're using, so front end people, for example, we're always looking for like JavaScript, TypeScript, Angular, React, right? And so if they don't have any of those things in there, they also get declined or we reject them, right? But basic languages that we use in our system, what companies they've worked on, what projects you've worked on, complexity, we look at all those things.
Sounds great, thank you. And the next question is about the side projects, like especially for the new grads. Like, what is the expectation in terms of projects? Because as you know, people don't have many opportunities of like building something big when they are studying undergrad.
Yeah, I know that's where it gets kind of tricky. We're not going to expect you to build a product by any means, right? We know this is a project and we're a capstone project or a side project that you're building, but we typically look for, again, what did you build? How did you build it? And again, like, how deep is it, right? Like, if it is a project that didn't take you very long, or if it is a project that actually took some time to get onto into its full form, right? GitHub should be your friend here, and we don't really expect you to have done too much, but that's the only signal we can really get, right? Outside of that.
Got it. Thank you. And so, like, I guess this is a specific question to the roles, but maybe you can mention about the roles that you're hiring. Like, are there any specific frameworks that you expect candidates to have experience on?
Yeah,
Like,
what can you clarify a little bit more?
Like technologies, like any specific programming languages, or let's say frameworks that you know the roles that you're hiring are requiring. Like it can be in the specific of your organization or broader to Alphabet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay. In general, I would say if we were looking for front-end people, we look for the same things I just listed: JavaScript, TypeScript, Angular, React, right? If you have any of those building blocks, like that's already a pretty good sign if we were looking for someone that can do sort of more web-based work and application work. I think for backend, much more open, your Python, your Java, and again, if we want to get more system level, then we look at C++, right? So those are all relevant languages. Cloud is really now, and so we basically do look for some type of cloud exposure. Alphabet uses GCP, not surprisingly, but like experience is also great. Azure is also great too. Yeah, I think they're fairly standard. I don't overemphasize on a lot of these things unless we look for, again, something specific. And something you can always tell recruiters in the future is, and I think most of you are probably going to say this, is that you're open to learning new languages, right? Being language agnostic is very critical in most tech companies, because if you were just like married to one, you're never going to be able to really find a job, in my opinion. And some candidates are like this, but yeah, being language agnostic is really important.
Mm-hmm. Having exposure and being open to learn different technologies and use, very cool. And this is an interesting one. How does a candidate's accent matter in communication in the interview process?
Legally, it shouldn't. But we're humans, and I do think if you're not able to communicate to the person that you're talking to, it does get, it's hard for you to explain what you're doing, right? If they're not understanding what you're saying. So unfortunately, it does play a bit of a part if the person that you're talking to can't comprehend what you're trying to tell them, because it has other implications, right? Because if they're having trouble hearing you, what is it going to be like when you join the company and other stakeholders are involved, right? Like, how will you communicate with the team? It's a soft skill, right? But it's still a skill that they evaluate. Now, if you crush it in your interviews and you have a bit of an accent, and I don't think it's going to be an issue, but if your interviews aren't great and it was really hard to comprehend and follow what you're doing, then it's a little bit harder to make a case. I think communication is a soft skill that most people don't think about, but it is really important, because we think about like, okay, this person was a joy to the team. How would they be able to communicate their ideas with us? And how will they be able to build a product with us?
So true. So at A2SV, we modeled this like this, Susan. So this is your technical abilities. This is your communication skills. And these two are going to be multiplied to decide on your final score. Because
it's really true. Yeah.
Like as you said, if you have amazing ideas, but if you're not able to communicate them, the other person can get as much as you can communicate. So it's like a filter. Very true. So the next question is relevant to this. So you have already partially answered. It asks, what matters the most, the technical ability or the communication ability of the candidate? Like, are there any minimum thresholds for both?
Yeah, I would say it's a balancing act. So technical ability is really important, but let's say if your technical ability is like okay, but your communication is phenomenal, it could be one of those like, well, they did okay, it was passable, but this person is teachable and we want to work with them. So yes, let's move forward. If the technical ability is amazing and the communication is terrible, then it becomes okay, they're great, but how do we work with them? Or if then the communication is okay and the technical ability, right, then it's a no-brainer, right? It's like, yes, let's move forward, right? So I do think it's a balancing act, because we have actually rejected candidates when the communication skills were really questionable, and it may not even be accent related, right? It could just be they did really communicate at all during the interview. We had to push a lot to get information out of them. Like it could be, it may not necessarily be accent related, and we could still say, okay, this is weird. We probably don't know if we can, it would be too hard to work with this person, right? So you have to realize these people are probably thinking along the lines of, can I work with this human being, and are they going to be able to be productive in our team? So it's a balance.
Yes, and you make a super important point here. At the end of the day, for every interviewer, this is more of a thumbs up, thumbs down decision. Hey, do I want to work with this person or not?
Yeah. So don't be an asshole.
So next question. So this is about, especially for people who are coming from out of United States. So can you tell us about the visa processes for different office locations at Google? Like how does it work? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we are not entirely involved in the visa process. We do have an immigration team that supports all of us. So I won't be able to speak to specificity, but it depends on your country of origin, right? So your citizenship, and we hold your citizenship from, and that will dictate what type of process we go with, right? Most commonly, we go through the H-1B process. I would say that's the most standard for most countries. That's the longest process, so not all companies are interested in doing that. But coming to the US, that's probably the most common one. It does involve putting your name in a drawing. You have to do it by March, so you'd have to have interviewed and have an offer by then. I think the drawings happen sometimes in July, and then you'd be able to start in October. So it's a long process. It's the most common one that most people go through, and I will say not all companies are willing to do this if they're looking to hire someone to start within 2 months, right? And if they have project deadlines, they're probably not as interested in doing that. Bigger companies like the Googles are probably going to have a little bit more patience to put you through the whole ringer. Other visas, again, will depend on your country of origin. H-1B1 is for like Singapore and Chilean. TN for Canada, it's pretty straightforward. And you can always, the O1 is for extraordinary, and that's a long process too, but that's another avenue. I would say coming to the US is not easy. There are probably other countries that are a little bit easier to get into.
Mhm. And one follow-up question regarding this, Susan. How often do you bring people with L1 visa, meaning starting in one of the international offices, and after they have at least a year in the company, an internal company transfer through L1? Is that a common path?
Yes, that is a pretty common path. It's way more straightforward than re-sponsoring. So yeah, we get that a lot. People who are in the India office, they typically take the L1 here. In Europe, same thing. So we get it. Not as common as one would think. And I think a lot of it comes with the fact that once you live in another country, do you really want to move to another country? So it just kind of depends on the person. But yeah, we do those.
Mhm. So the next question, Susan, is about our specific position. So as you know, pretty much all our candidates are coming from Africa, mostly Ethiopia, and the companies don't have many positive samples interviewing candidates coming from a similar background to ours. So how do you think, like for A2SVians, we can like break the bias here? Because like we have very good past success in the interviews. We do some project work like at scale. So each group of our students, they work on one project together. They get exposed to different tech stacks and learn how to work in a team environment. So like how can we shine in our cold applications through our CV, LinkedIn profile? What would you highlight if you were in our seats?
The project specifically, I would say you should feel free to highlight, but it is tricky because I can tell you sometimes what people see is, this isn't going to be a really long immigration process. So there's only so many companies, again, large companies that are really open to doing a full H-1B process for most of the international folks, right? But some companies will do it. Calling those projects out would be great. I think if you're open to really being explicit, you can get more detailed, like I'm willing to move to different countries, or like you're not stuck in one location. You can always say like, I'm open to relocation, or you can also note in there that you're open to starting at different hours, whichever the case is. I think open to relocation is probably the cleanest way to say like, I'm very open to exploring what type of options that you might have. Because sometimes when we see a location in LinkedIn, we're like, oh, this person's in a different country. They're not going to be interested, right? So if you specifically put in there that you're open to relocation and then you're open to those specific locations, that can help and at least signal to the recruiting team that, oh, hey, this person is open to being in different places.
That's a very good point. I believe this is something that we should definitely highlight more. Like what options we are open for, right? If that country doesn't work for us, if we make it clear that another country would be still ideal for us, that's an important point. Thank you. All right. So next, like regarding preparing our LinkedIn profile, like are there any good or star LinkedIn profiles or CVs that you have seen in the past, like from a new grad, and you were like, wow. Like when you think of them, like what were the key points that actually sparked your attention?
Yeah, well, I think there's obviously the general route that most people take, which is putting down their specific information, putting out like links to the work that they've done. Those are always, like, I would say, your most basic building blocks. Like if you want to at least get a strong like LinkedIn profile, have those pieces in addition to things which I don't think is something that everyone does, but the one that stood out to me is when people have a really strong personality in their like LinkedIn profiles, right? If they explicitly talk about what they do on the side, or they like put pictures of like some of the projects they've done, right? Those typically stand out a little bit more. But it's one of those, like, if your basic work isn't in there, but your CV is fun, doesn't matter, right? But if you're talking about trying to stand out amongst the crowd a little bit more, like being able to kind of showcase a bit of personality, that's probably like the little cherry on top where you're like, oh, what am I reading right now? You know, some people call themselves like, I am a coding monkey, or like I'm a coding extraordinaire, and like they give themselves nicknames. Like little things like that kind of stand out, but it doesn't really matter though if the rest of the CV isn't there, right? So.
I see. Thank you. And now let's get on the fly questions. So team, if you have a question, please write +1 to the chat window and we can give you voice. Alternatively, you can directly write your question in the chat window and we can read. And in the meantime, Susan, in our Q&As, normally it flows both ways. Sorry, since you are a recruiter, we already have too many questions for you. But if there is anything you want to learn about A2SV, we would love to answer.
I know we only have 2 minutes, so I really want to prioritize answering your questions because I do want to make this as open as possible. So, but if there isn't, then I'm happy to take.
All right, looks like nothing is coming to the chat window. So I guess
Okay.
the time is yours.
Awesome. Well, I guess from your perspectives then, if you guys want to chime in, what has been one of the major pain points with working with recruiting?
Like first, getting the doors open at the beginning. Even if we had amazing success rate with Google and indicated this on our CVs, when we do cold applications, we just don't hear back anything, you know. And like that's the most disappointing thing because like when you open the channel, the rest can come. And if they say no at some point after talking to you or after you take a coding challenge, then you can understand. You can be like, hey, I gotta be better. But if you don't hear anything and your application just dies, this is disappointing. And usually that's our biggest challenge. That's the first thing. And second, since we apply from Ethiopia, when we are working with companies or recruiters that are trying to fill out seats in the US, nowadays, pretty much no one is looking to apply for H-1B for new grads because like there is uncertainty. You apply and you may or may not get it. And this makes headcount calculations very, very complicated. And as a result, for the new grads, companies tend to avoid it right now. And what other issues? So sometimes, like especially in today's economic climate, the hiring policies may change quickly. Like a company brings hiring freeze, nobody hears anything. A company slows down hiring and they stop hiring for new grads. So for us, this is also hiring freeze since we have mostly new grads. So like those type of changes due to economic climate, that was a problem for us, I would say. So these are the main pressing factors usually. Like after we open the door, after they know how good quality our candidates are, like everybody loves. All the companies we worked with, we received very positive messages regarding how good quality are candidates, how great it is to communicate with them. So Susan, we get a question. Nowadays, some companies are slowing down their hiring efforts. And what is the reason behind this? And how is this going to affect the new grad applications? And how long do you think this is going to take?
This is a really good question because yes, it's top of mind for a lot of companies right now. So as you're all probably really aware, early in the year, it was a hiring bonanza. Like everyone was hiring. It was an incredibly competitive field. It was definitely the employees market. Sometime in the summer, what happened was obviously the economy started kind of seeing signs of recession. A lot of companies also overhired in that aggressive climate. And I think a lot of companies overspent. Plus, with the recession and the economic slowdown, most companies are starting to cut costs, right? So the first things that went out was the fund budget for us. But the secondary thing is typically we cut down open headcount. So why do we do that? Because it's easier to cut down open headcount than it is to fire employees. We don't want to fire employees, right? So that tends to be the priorities. And you're right, new grad hiring tends to be the first that takes into play because what happens is these teams that may have had like 10 headcount suddenly have 2. And so they're thinking like, oh, we only have 2 now. We probably would really want someone with a bit more experience than hiring a new grad, unless that team is overstacked with senior people, right? So you're right, it has taken into effect. I will say we've seen this ebbs and flow before, like last year, same thing. So I will say it probably would last probably until at least the rest of this year. Again, once we figure out hiring plans for
Susan,
20.
sorry, it's about to finish in 30 seconds. We thank you very much for all the sincere answers. This was amazing. See you.
Awesome.